Hi guys, Richard Lackey here. For any of you watching for the first time, this channel is all about doing big things with small cameras. Right here you can join me on my quest to find the best tools, gear and techniques to make smartphone movies that look like movies shot on motion picture film and not bad smartphone video. If this sounds like what you're trying to achieve with your videos, I encourage you to subscribe and turn on notifications because I'm going to share with you methods and explain the reasons behind them in ways you're not likely to find anyone else talking about. Today I'm talking about exposure. After fighting with Apple's dynamic tone mapping on the iPhone XS Max for a year, I found that the best images are achieved by letting Apple's AI do what it was designed to do, instead of fighting it. This means relying on the exposure reticle in FiLMiC Pro to set and lock your exposure, and only make small manual adjustments afterwards. The best way to do this is to use a variable ND filter. In this video, I'm going to break down the steps that I take to set and lock exposure correctly using the PolarPro Peter McKinnon Edition variable ND filters. First, I'm going to give you some context and explain the bigger picture. A large part of what I do happens in post-production. It happens with me sitting at my laptop for hours after actually shooting. The key in all of this is to shoot for post in the first place. You can't manipulate and craft an image in post if you haven't captured all the necessary image information. Capturing that information is often down to exposure and how shadow, midtone and highlight levels are recorded. Of course, FiLMiC Pro gives you control over shutter speed and ISO, as well as the ability to adjust shadows and highlights. But in bright conditions, without an ND filter, your shutter speed has to be fast to ensure your image isn't overexposed. And this means anything in motion isn't going to be smooth, it's going to appear stuttered. If the goal is to capture video that can be transformed into something that doesn't look like it was shot on a smartphone, your shutter speed needs to be much slower, no matter how bright the conditions. The best way to manually control exposure without upsetting tone mapping and maintain a slow shutter speed is to use an ND filter in front of your camera lens to reduce the amount of light. There are a lot of ND filter solutions on the market now for smartphone videography. Many of them are fixed ND filters that reduce the amount of light passing through them by a fixed amount. Using fixed ND filters means you need a range of different density filters for different lighting conditions. It also means you can't make small adjustments easily. The best solution is to use a variable ND filter. These are the PolarPro Peter McKinnon Edition variable ND filters. Now they're intended for mirrorless and DSLR lenses, and they are at the high end in terms of quality and price, but they're awesome to use for a smartphone too. Grab a pen and paper because I'm going to share a lot of information with you and you might want to take notes. Let's take a look. Sometimes you'll have too much contrast in the scene and it's impossible to expose for both the brightest and darkest parts. You need to decide what's most important, but keep in mind smartphones handle overexposure very badly. As a rule, I avoid overexposing highlights no matter what, and that's what I recommend. If there's a subject or action, it needs to be in the bright part of the image that I've exposed for and not in the shadows. This is something you need to keep in mind when you're blocking a scene or when you're storyboarding or planning a sequence. In a high contrast backlit scene, I'll always choose a silhouette over exposing for the shadows and blowing out the highlights. Shooting with a smartphone is all about creative compromise. There are certain things a smartphone camera just doesn't do well, and those things should be avoided. You simply plan and shoot around the limitations. That's why I always expose to protect the highlights, and I plan shots around this. The first step is to frame up your shot, decide what elements in the scene you're exposing for, and just how strong an ND filter you need to maintain a shutter speed at half your frame rate. I'm shooting at 24 frames a second, so I'm aiming for a shutter speed of 1/48 of a second. The brightest parts of this scene are lit by full sun, so that's what I want to expose for. Before anything, I'm going to make sure I'm in FiLMiC Log V2 and make sure the white balance is set to daylight and locked. I recommend using the daylight white balance preset in most situations, unless you're specifically shooting under warm lighting, in which case the tungsten preset often works well. I used to set the white balance for every individual shot manually using the target on my X-Rite Color Checker Video Passport, but I've found it's much better to use the preset. It gives much more consistent results and easier shot matching in post. Now that white balance is locked, I'll place the exposure reticle over the sky, that usually works well for me, and open the manual controls to check the shutter speed. It's very high as expected. Tap on the A to open analytics and turn on the zebra stripes. The red areas show overexposure and the blue areas show underexposure. As I explained before, you want to avoid clipping highlights. Overexposure and white clipped areas are a dead giveaway of smartphone video. I already know from experience that in bright sunlight I need an ND 6 or 7 to maintain a 48th of a second shutter speed at 24 frames a second. So that's where I'm going to start. The PolarPro Peter McKinnon Edition variable NDs come in two strengths, a 2 to 5 stop and a 6 to 9 stop. So I'm going to use the 6 to 9. Right now I'm using the Ulanzi video cage for the iPhone 11 Pro Max and the Ulanzi 17mm to 52mm adapter. I'll thread a 52 to 67mm step-up ring to accommodate the variable ND filter. These filters are available in three sizes. These are 67mm, but they also come in 77mm and 82mm sizes. I recommend the 67mm for smartphone use. It's big enough to cover all kinds of configurations, but not too big. See how dark the image is now that the ND filter is attached. Now I'll use the exposure reticle to reset the exposure here. Note that the shutter speed is right where we want it. I'll turn on the zebra stripes again to check areas that may be overexposed. I'll also check the clipping. The last thing to do is turn the variable ND slightly to reduce the highlight clipping. This is my optimal exposure, and white balance is already locked, so I'm ready to record, simple as that. I record a few seconds of the X-Rite Color Checker so I have a reference of where various real-world gray levels end up being encoded in the image, and importantly, the color chips. Remember, if you're shooting a chart, always make sure it's lit evenly by the key light source in the scene. That's about it. Once locked, try to keep your exposure setup the same for any shots in the same scene under the same lighting conditions. If you need to make adjustments, go ahead but follow the same steps. The PolarPro Variable NDs are not cheap, but they are just about the best you can buy. They're an investment in your image, and you can also use them with mirrorless and DSLR lenses. You can use any variable ND, but many of them introduce color shifts and artifacts depending on the strength. These filters don't cause any color shifts or artifacts, and I really like the markings around the outside edge that tell you the exact density. This really is the best way to control exposure and record optimal image information for color correction and grading. I hope this helps you step up the quality of your own videos. There's a lot more to it, but this is a critical part of it that opens up a lot of possibilities in post. Remember to subscribe if you want to learn more, and let me know if you have any questions in the comments. Thanks for watching.